In the middle of chaos, when the world was burning in war, a silent army rose, not with guns, but with compassion. They were called the angels of the battlefield, the women who fought not to kill, but to save. As the First World War erupted in 1914, millions of men marched to the front lines, leaving behind their families, homes, and safety. But as the battles grew bloodier, a new kind of hero emerged: women who stepped forward to heal the broken and comfort the dying. When the war began, very few could imagine women working so close to danger. Yet, soon the sound of explosions mixed with the cries of wounded soldiers became the daily reality for thousands of female nurses. Across Europe, field hospitals were set up just a few miles away from the front. The trenches were filled with mud, blood, and screams. Doctors were overwhelmed, and the number of injured soldiers grew by the hour. That's when women, from all backgrounds, joined as volunteer nurses, determined to make a difference. In Britain, thousands enlisted in the Voluntary Aid Detachments, known as the VADs. Many of them had never worked in hospitals before. They learned quickly how to bandage wounds, stop bleeding, and even perform surgeries under fire. These women were young, brave, and untrained, yet they became the backbone of wartime medicine. One of the most remarkable among them was Edith Cavell, a British nurse whose story became a symbol of courage and humanity. Working in occupied Belgium, Edith ran a small hospital in Brussels. When the German army took control, she faced a difficult choice: obey the occupiers or help those in need. She chose humanity. Edith began secretly helping Allied soldiers escape from German captivity, even though she knew the risk. She treated wounded men from both sides, Germans and Allies, believing that compassion should not wear a uniform. Her actions soon drew the attention of the German authorities. In 1915, she was arrested, tried, and executed by firing squad. Her final words became immortal: "Patriotism is not enough. I must have no hatred or bitterness toward anyone." These words echoed across the world, reminding humanity that mercy survives even in war. But Edith was not alone. Thousands of nurses worked day and night in field hospitals, operating under unbearable conditions. They battled exhaustion, diseases, and the constant threat of bombings. Many died from infections, shell fire, or exhaustion, yet their names rarely made it to history books. In France, the Red Cross ran emergency hospitals that treated tens of thousands of injured soldiers. Women from countries like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand volunteered as nurses overseas. They left their homes, crossed oceans, and worked in tents or converted barns, often without proper equipment or medical supplies. Imagine the scene: a muddy tent filled with stretchers, the air thick with smoke and fear. A nurse kneels beside a young soldier, holding his hand as he breathes his last. No news cameras, no medals, just quiet courage. These women faced not only the horrors of war, but also the prejudice of society. In the early 1900s, women were rarely seen as professionals, especially in war zones. Yet World War I changed that perception forever. It proved that courage has no gender. Even soldiers, hardened by battle, began calling them the angels. They brought comfort when hope was lost, sometimes with nothing more than a kind word, a letter from home, or a gentle touch. In countries like Russia, women nurses worked alongside male doctors near the Eastern Front. Some royal women even volunteered. The Russian Grand Duchess, Tatiana Nikolaevna, daughter of Tsar Nicholas II, served as a nurse, cleaning wounds and assisting surgeons. The sight of royalty tending to wounded peasants shocked many, but it showed how war broke down barriers of class and privilege. Meanwhile, in India and across the British colonies, women also stepped forward. Indian and colonial nurses worked in field hospitals in Mesopotamia and Egypt, serving under brutal heat and unsanitary conditions. Their contributions were often ignored by Western historians, but they too were part of this global sisterhood of bravery. By 1918, as the war neared its end, nursing had transformed from a charitable act into a respected profession. Women had proven themselves not only as caregivers, but as essential members of wartime operations. The war also gave rise to permanent medical institutions. The efforts of these women laid the foundation for modern military nursing and public health care. Many who returned home continued their service in hospitals and humanitarian organizations, shaping the future of global medicine. When the men went to fight the war, the women stayed back and built it. When the First World War began in 1914, Europe was not only divided by front lines, but also by fear. Millions of men were called to fight, leaving behind empty factories, silent workshops, and abandoned machines. The war demanded not just soldiers, but weapons, bullets, uniforms, and endless supplies. And that's when women stepped out of their homes and into history. Across Britain, France, Germany, and beyond, women filled the gap left by men. They entered the factories, shipyards, and ammunition plants, places they had never been allowed to work before. It was the dawn of a new revolution, a workforce of women who powered the war from behind the lines. In Britain, they were called the munitionettes, a name that would soon symbolize courage and sacrifice. By 1916, over 1 million British women were working in munitions factories, producing the shells, bullets, and explosives that kept the armies fighting. But this was no ordinary job. The work was dangerous, dirty, and deadly. They handled TNT, a toxic chemical that turned their skin yellow and their hair green. Soon, people began calling them canary girls. The chemical slowly poisoned them from within, causing nausea, breathing problems, and even death. Still, they worked. Every shell they made could save a soldier's life at the front. Every bullet they packed brought the war one step closer to its end. Many of these women worked 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, often sleeping in the factory itself. There were no safety standards, no protective gear. Accidents were common. One wrong move, and an entire factory could explode. In January 1917, in Silvertown, East London, such a disaster struck. A TNT factory caught fire and exploded, destroying hundreds of homes and killing 70 people, many of them women workers. The explosion was heard miles away, and the night sky glowed orange. Yet, the very next morning, women from nearby factories came to work as usual. Their courage was unmatched. They were fighting a different kind of battle, not in the trenches, but with machines and metal. These women worked in shifts that blurred day and night. They melted steel, carried shells weighing over 50 pounds, and operated heavy machinery once considered, quote, too hard for women. Their hands were blistered, their faces covered in soot, but their determination never faded. The war had changed everything. Before 1914, most women were confined to domestic work or teaching. But the war opened doors that had always been closed. In Britain, the number of working women increased from 3 million to over 5 million. It wasn't just in Britain. In France, women worked in aircraft factories, assembling engines and building artillery parts. In Germany, they filled positions in chemical plants and even on railways. In Russia, women worked as engineers, drivers, and laborers, keeping the massive war machine moving. For the first time, women earned their own wages, stood beside men in industrial jobs, and proved their strength in ways society had never imagined. But life wasn't easy. The air inside the munitions factories was heavy with dust and fumes. Workers suffered from chronic coughs, skin burns, and headaches. Some factories were so hot that women fainted at their machines. Others went blind due to constant exposure to chemicals. Still, they kept going, because every explosion on the front was powered by their effort behind it. The government soon realized how vital these women were. Posters appeared across cities, urging more women to join the workforce. One British poster read, "These women are doing their bit. Learn to make munitions." The propaganda worked, not through fear, but through pride. Women saw themselves not as victims of war, but as soldiers in their own right. There was one woman whose story captured this spirit perfectly, Elsie Ferguson, a young munitions worker from Glasgow. She joined the factory at just 18, working on the assembly line for 14 hours a day. In her diary, she wrote, "Every time I lift a shell, I feel its weight in my bones. I imagine a soldier waiting for it. If my hands stop, maybe he dies. so I cannot stop." Her words represented an entire generation of women who carried the weight of war in their hands. But behind the pride lay pain. Many women lost their lives in silent tragedies that never reached the headlines. Some died of chemical poisoning, others were buried in factory explosions. There were no medals for them, no honors on the battlefield, just quiet funerals and fading memories. And beyond factories, women also took on roles as tram conductors, post office clerks, and police officers. They drove ambulances, repaired vehicles, and worked on farms, keeping their countries alive while their men fought overseas. They smiled in daylight, but worked in darkness. They carried no guns, yet every secret they whispered could change the course of a war. They were the women of shadows, the spies of World War I. In a war fought with tanks, trenches, and bombs, information was the most powerful weapon of all. Behind enemy lines, messages were exchanged, secrets were stolen, and codes were broken, often by women whose courage was hidden beneath elegance and charm. These women were not soldiers. They were dancers, nurses, couriers, and socialites, invisible to suspicion, yet deadly to empires. Their missions were silent, their victories uncelebrated, and their deaths often forgotten. The most famous among them was Mata Hari, a name that still echoes through the halls of espionage and intrigue. Born Margaretha Geertruida Zell in the Netherlands, Mata Hari reinvented herself as an exotic dancer in Paris. Her performances, filled with mystery and seduction, captivated audiences across Europe, including generals, diplomats, and high-ranking officers. But as war erupted in 1914, her charm became both her strength and her curse. France accused her of using her beauty to gather secrets for Germany. German intelligence also claimed her as their agent. In truth, she may have been trapped between both sides, trying to survive a game far more dangerous than she realized. In 1917, French authorities arrested her, accusing her of espionage that allegedly caused the deaths of thousands of soldiers. Her trial was swift, her defense weak, and the evidence uncertain, yet the public wanted a symbol, someone to blame for their losses. Mata Hari became that symbol. On October 15, 1917, she faced a firing squad near Paris. Witnesses say she refused the blindfold and looked her executioners straight in the eye. Her last words were quiet. "Men have been shooting women for ages. They just call it justice." Whether she was truly a spy or simply a scapegoat remains one of history's greatest mysteries. But Mata Hari's story revealed something powerful, that in war, perception can be deadlier than truth. Yet she was not alone in the shadows. Across Europe, other women risked everything to gather intelligence, move coded messages, and help prisoners escape. One of them was Louise de Bettigny, a French woman who became one of the most effective spies for the Allies. Using the alias Alice Dubois, she created a vast intelligence network in German-occupied France. Louise and her agents carried information about troop movements and artillery positions using secret letters hidden in shoes, baskets, and even loaves of bread. Her reports were so precise that they helped the British Army win key battles on the Western Front. But in 1915, she was captured by German forces. Even under brutal interrogation, she refused to reveal a single name. She died in prison in 1918, just weeks before the war ended, her identity hidden until long after her death. Her courage earned her the nickname, the Queen of Spies. Then there was Gabrielle Petit, another Belgian spy who worked for British intelligence. She smuggled maps, guided Allied soldiers through occupied territory, and sent coded messages disguised as love letters. When she was caught, she was executed by the Germans. But after the war, she became a national hero in Belgium. Her statue still stands in Brussels as a symbol of resistance. Women spies used clever disguises and secret codes to evade capture. Some pretended to be traveling saleswomen, others acted as nuns or nurses to cross borders freely. They used everything, invisible ink, flowers arranged in patterns, even embroidery, to pass messages. Their intelligence work often decided battles long before soldiers even arrived on the front lines. A single message carried by a woman on a bicycle could alter the fate of thousands. The spy networks also relied on ordinary women who never thought of themselves as heroes. In small towns and villages, women passed on whispers they heard from enemy soldiers, railway stations, or taverns. This silent communication web became one of the most effective intelligence systems in wartime Europe. But being a spy was not glamorous. It was lonely, terrifying, and often deadly. Agents lived in constant fear. One wrong glance, one intercepted letter, and their lives would end. Unlike soldiers, they had no uniforms, no protection under wartime law. If caught, they were executed as traitors, not honored as prisoners of war. Women spies faced a double danger, not just from the enemy, but from their own societies, which often refused to believe that women could be capable of espionage. They used that disbelief to their advantage, blending invisibly into the background, listening carefully, and striking silently. In the Middle East, Ottoman intelligence used female informants to monitor British movements. When the guns finally fell silent, the battle for peace had only just begun. The soldiers went home as heroes, but what about the women who held the world together? In November 1918, the First World War came to an end. The sound of gunfire faded, the trenches emptied, and the world took its first deep breath in 4 long years. But for millions of women, the war didn't end with the peace treaties. It marked the beginning of a new fight, a fight for recognition, equality, and identity. During the war, women had worked as nurses, factory workers, spies, farmers, and couriers. They had carried the burden of a global conflict on their shoulders, often without medals or headlines. When the soldiers returned, they were celebrated. Parades filled the streets, flags waved, and nations honored their warriors. But the women quietly faded back into the background. Governments across Europe encouraged them to return to their homes, to step aside so that returning men could reclaim their jobs. Posters that once praised women for doing their bit were replaced with slogans urging them to, quote, go back to normal life. But after everything they had seen, these women could never go back to what normal meant. They had proven their strength, their skill, and their intelligence. They had shown that they were not just caretakers or helpers. They were builders, leaders, and survivors. And slowly, quietly, they began to change the world. The fight for recognition. The first battle after the war was not fought with weapons, but with words, the battle for recognition. During the war, millions of women had entered the workforce for the first time. In Britain alone, over 5 million women were employed in 1918. When the soldiers returned, most of these women were forced out. But they didn't accept it silently. The war had opened their eyes to new possibilities. Women had tasted independence, earning wages, managing responsibilities, and making decisions that once belonged only to men. They had worked 12-hour shifts, risked their lives in hospitals and factories, and managed entire households while raising children alone. Now they wanted a voice. In 1918, the same year the war ended, the British Parliament passed the Representation of the People Act, granting the right to vote to women over the age of 30 who met property requirements. It wasn't full equality yet, but it was a beginning, a spark that would ignite a worldwide movement. By 1920, women in the United States had won the right to vote through the 19th Amendment. In Germany, women gained suffrage that same year. In Russia, women already had the right to vote since the 1917 revolution. And across the world, from Canada to New Zealand, the tide was turning. The same women who had once worked in the shadows of war were now standing in the light, demanding equality, education, and respect. The cost of survival. But victory came with scars. The war had taken more than lives. It had taken husbands, brothers, and sons. Entire villages had lost their male populations. By 1921, there were millions of widows across Europe, and an entire generation of women left unmarried. They were called the surplus women. Newspapers labeled them as a problem, suggesting they would never marry or have families. But these so-called surplus women refused to accept that label. Instead, they turned their grief into purpose. Many became teachers, social workers, and activists. They helped rebuild their countries, educated orphans, and cared for wounded veterans who had returned broken from the front. One such woman was Vera Brittain, a British nurse who lost her fiancé, her brother, and two close friends during the war. Instead of giving up, she began to write. Her book, Testament of Youth, became one of the most powerful accounts of the female wartime experience, a voice for a generation of women who had seen too much but refused to be silent. Her words echoed across nations. The world is not made of men alone. The rise of working women. As the 1920s began, women continued to work, not just out of necessity, but by choice. They entered offices, schools, and public service. They became journalists, artists, and scientists. In cities like London, New York, and Berlin, the image of the modern woman emerged, independent, educated, and ambitious. The industries women helped sustain during the war continued to grow, and they were no longer seen merely as temporary replacements. Governments began to realize that women were essential to economic recovery. In Britain, women like Nancy Astor broke barriers by entering Parliament. In 1919, she became the first woman to take a seat in the House of Commons. Her presence symbolized how far women had come, from the hospitals and factories of war to the halls of political power.